2022 midterm elections are just weeks away. Every national election is called the most important election of our lifetime. This election is no exception. What's at stake? A possible power shift in the U.S. House of Representatives and U.S. Senate. And that's just the beginning. Good evening. Welcome to another special edition of The Daily Drum, a collaboration between 96.3 WHUR, HUR Voices, and WHUT-TV. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, make it count. The power of your vote. Are you in? We'll share information and talk to the experts to make sure your vote is protected and your ballot counts. We have a great panel of experts to lead us through this topic. My guests are Stephanie L. Young, Executive Director of When We All Vote. Now, you may remember this nonpartisan organization was first created by First Lady Michelle Obama to increase voter participation by closing the race and age gap. Also joining us tonight, Christelle Chawu, Social Action Committee co-chair with the Howard University Student Bar Association. And she'll bring us some insight on what young voters are doing and thinking about. I want to thank both of you for joining this part of the discussion. Stephanie, let me first ask you about your election 2022 concerns. Are we still facing voter intimidation and voter suppression issues?
Yes, thanks for having me on here tonight. Look, voter suppression is real and it's alive in this country. There have been over 500 bills introduced and or passed in states like Florida, Texas, Georgia. And these bills are definitely targeting people of color. They're definitely targeting young people, those with disabilities, working class Americans, shutting down polling places, or more importantly, shutting down opportunities to vote early, which we know a lot of people need more access to, taking away drop boxes in heavily populated areas for folks to drop off their mail-in ballots. Also passing legislation in Florida for election police to potentially create some sort of intimidation at the polls. So voter suppression is a real and it's live. And because of how especially African-American voters and young voters showed up in 2020, we had over 60% of people voting, the highest voter turnout in modern history. We had 50% of young people voting. And what happens when we all actually vote, things change and things move forward, and people are afraid of that. They understand how powerful our vote is. And as African-Americans go, there's 30 million African-Americans who are eligible to vote this election season. So people are afraid of our power, and they're doing all that they can to get in the way of ensuring that we can cast our ballot in certain states. But I can rest assured that there are folks all around this country fighting against that, like us at When We All Vote, and many, many other organizations. And people are still getting registered, still making their plans to vote, and still voting early.
Yeah. Christelle, you are, at least for the purposes of this conversation, you are really, the voice of young people. You're in law school at Howard University, which in and of itself is a fantastic place to be at this time. But talk to me about the kinds of conversations that you and your colleagues are having regarding voting in 2022. Take us inside those conversations.
Yeah, so like Stephanie mentioned, a lot of states have these voter suppression laws, and a lot of things are changing, and people are trying to make sure that registration statuses, there's issues with that. People getting to the polls, there's issues with that. And there's a lot of things changing that people are not aware of in different states. For example, this past weekend, I led a group of students to North Carolina where we worked with the Young Black Lawyers Organizing Coalition, YBLOC, who their mission is to educate and empower voters in these different states, North Carolina, Texas, Georgia, to make sure that the local communities are aware of these changing ordinances. They're aware of how they can make sure that their votes are counted and that they're not reaching any issues at the polls. So what we're doing here at Howard Law specifically, and what I think is a great great mission that we have, is to get the students involved in this mission, going across to different states. We have 2 more trips to Georgia and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania coming up in November to make sure that we are a part of this conversation. We are bringing this back to our own social groups and other law students, making sure that they're aware of what's going on in these midterm elections, and that we're all being a part of the conversation and making sure that everyone's voice is heard.
Tell me a little bit more about that activity from the weekend. I'm curious about that. So you and the others, you were actually in North Carolina?
Yes, so we went to Raleigh, North Carolina, Raleigh-Durham, specifically Wake County, Friday, and then on Saturday we participated in, we heard from some local leaders, a reverend who was big on the voter empowerment mission in his community, and then we also heard from a politician, Antoine Marshall, who gave us a little bit of a background on the Voting Act and then how the voting suppression laws have become an issue in North Carolina. And then we went around and we canvassed to some predetermined residents to make sure that they have a plan to vote and that they're aware of their rights and that they know where to get information. We went to St. Augustine's Homecoming Yard Fest. So we went around with pamphlets. We were just speaking to anyone we could really come across, making sure that, do you have a plan to vote? Are you registered? Is this a conversation that you're having in your social groups? So that's what we did on Saturday. And then Sunday, we had the theme of meeting people where they are. So we also went to a couple different churches, and thankfully the pastors allowed us to give short, brief educational sessions to the congregations about 5 elements that they can think about when they're thinking about voting, making sure that they're checking their registration statuses, because in some locations, people can be taken off the registration list for whatever reasons, changing ordinances, and they may not even know it until they get to the ballot, and then it becomes an issue. So making sure people are aware to check your registration, check the instructions for absentee ballots, making a plan within your family, because those who are those who have a plan to vote are more likely to vote. And one of the slogans we used all weekend was that if you don't have a seat at the table, you're most likely on the menu. So that was our theme, to make sure that people know if you're not a part of the conversation, right? If you're not a part of the conversation, if you're not a part of these momentous decision-making, implementations, then you're probably going to be just legislated on without any consideration towards you. So
that is a fantastic exercise. I commend you and your colleagues. I'm encouraged to know that that young people are out and trying not only to make sure that they as individuals are able to exercise their right to vote, but also encouraging others and to go to other states. I salute that. I want to now bring in Cliff Albright, who is the co-founder and the executive director of the Black Voters Matter Fund, a voting rights and community empowerment organization. Cliff, thank you so much for joining the conversation. My first question for you is, what about my voter rights? What should I know right now before I cast my ballot?
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Sure.
Well, the first thing we need to know that that our voting rights have been under attack, right? But to the extent that we still have it, and again, particularly depending on what states that we're in, that we're going to fully utilize that right. In some states we've got the right to vote by mail, and in others the focus is on going early to vote. I'm in Georgia right now, and I've got my I voted sticker on because today was the first day of early voting right here in Georgia. And then we've also still got the right to go and vote in person. One of the key things we always remind people about when they go to vote in person is knowing that, once you're on that line, if you're on the line before the time that polling place closes, then you've got the right to be able to go vote. Even if the line is too long for you to get in by the time the polling place closes, if you are on that line before the polling place closes, then you've got the right to cast that ballot. But at the end of the day, what we're seeing and what we're feeling is that there's a lot of energy out there. In fact, some of that energy is because there's been such a widespread attack on our voting rights, because there have been so many voter suppression bills, that the attitude that we've come across from some people, from many people, is that, if they're going to work that hard to take away my vote, that's going to make me work even harder to make sure that not only am I going to go vote, but I'm going to bring 5 people with me or bring 10 people with me. That's the kind of attitude that we saw. That's the kind of attitude that we saw in Georgia after 2018 when they suppressed the vote here, and then Black voters came back in 2020 and shocked the country. And we believe that that's the same kind of results that we're going to see all across the country this election cycle.
Stephanie, if I'm at my polling place and all of a sudden, for whatever reason, I have a problem voting at my voting site, what do I do? And where should I go? Who do I call?
Well, first thing, don't leave.
Okay.
I think people sometimes often make the mistake if they go and they say you're not on the rolls, or they, there's some sort of confusion, they leave. Stay right there and call our friends at the Lawyers Committee that are ready to take your call and help you sort through whatever the challenge is. It's 1-866-OUR-VOTE, OUR, 1-866-OUR-VOTE. Literally before you even go, you can call them just in case you're afraid of anything. They are there ready to answer your questions and ready to help you navigate any challenges that you might face.
Mm-hmm. That is such important information because, as we've discussed earlier, there is the mail-in voting, and some people may have mailed in, and it may have come to their attention that they perhaps forgot, or that they may need to do an absentee vote. I mean, there are so many ways, and for a lot of people, this can be confusing. I also wanted to get your response, Stephanie, to what you were hearing from Christelle, because this is obviously your wheelhouse, but and I was certainly impressed with what some of the younger people are doing. But what are your thoughts about what you heard from her?
Well, I'm absolutely just as impressed, and I'm going to figure out how we can still Christelle to come do some work with us at When We All Vote. One thing we rolled out this year was our HBCU campaign. I'm a proud graduate of Hampton University. And
the other HU.
The real one. No,
don't start this stuff during my show here. No, please go right ahead.
It's all love. But we just started a new campaign called Vote Loud, which is our way to organize campuses to start their very own voting squads. What Christelle mentioned also was voting together. Cliff also touched on that as well. We know that when people vote together, and there is a celebratory event at a polling place for people to go vote early together, we know that voting increases by 4%. So we are trying to equip the students on these campuses as they're building their own voting squads with grants to host their very own early voting events. And we're looking forward to seeing them kick off those events literally very soon, now that early voting has started in a lot of different states. And we need more young people, more Gen Zers who represent 1 out of 10 American voters who do not consume traditional news. Only 8% of them actually do. We need more of them talking to each other about these issues, because peer-to-peer organizing is actually the best type of organizing that we can do to help people understand that making the investment to vote is making an investment in your future. And voting is an investment. It's not a quick takeaway. It's something that we have to do over and over and over again. You open the show by saying, saying, is this the most important election of our lifetime? Every election is the most important election of our lifetime, because those who we elect at every level of government will make a huge impact no matter who the president is. They can do some wonderful things, but you'll never feel those wonderful things if you have a state legislature that doesn't even believe in democracy or believe that your life actually matters or is valued. So it's incredibly important to have more young people out there doing this work, doing the peer-to-peer organizing and speaking the language that their peers actually understand, to help empower them to understand how powerful their voice is, their vote is, and get them active in this work.
Christelle, I am going to come back to you, but I did want to ask this question of Cliff, because Cliff, we know historically that midterm elections just don't get the attention, they don't get the participation that presidential election years do. Do you believe that this year is different? How do you know?
Yeah, so the short answer, two short answers. One, yes, I believe it's different. And two, how I know is that because we've been out there in these streets in several states. It's not even just any one state, but in every state we go to, that we're feeling a different level of energy out there for this midterm than compared to any other midterm. And that's because, and that's for good reason, right? Like it's already been said, I'm glad to see my good friend Stephanie on here, my friend and sister Stephanie. But we always say, and you often hear, oh, this is the most important election, of our lifetimes. But think about it, right? Why is this election like really different and possibly the most true time that you've ever heard that statement? It's not every election year, midterm, presidential, or otherwise, that you're seeing such a rollback of rights, right? We're seeing a rollback of voting rights. We're seeing a rollback, literally, of reproductive justice rights that folks, that half this country has had for over 50 years. And for the first time, we're seeing a rollback of such rights, and a rollback of Supreme Court precedent in a way where it's not overturning previously bad restrictive decisions, but a rollback in the sense of overturning previous court precedent that had actually granted rights. So, and not to mention, oh, by the way, this also happens to be the first midterm elections after there's been an attempted insurrection of people attacking the U.S. Capitol. And so for a variety of reasons, and that insurrection is actually ongoing in slow motion. But so for a variety of reasons, yes, this really is probably the most important midterm that we've seen, or at least seen in at least a century. And that's the kind of feeling that we're getting as we're going around in all these cities and counties and states talking to people. There is a sense that there is something different about this. And yes, I do expect that we're going to see things happen in this election cycle, in this midterm election cycle, that we've never seen before in the other midterms. I expect that we're going to see higher early voting totals than what we've ever seen. I expect that we're going to see higher overall turnout than what we've ever seen. And particularly, again, from our perspective as Black Voters Matter, we believe that there's going to be at least 5, 6, maybe 7 states where there's going to be critical elections in terms of statewide elections that are going to be decided by the extent to which Black voters come out and exceed expectations. At the end of the day, polls don't vote. People vote. Mm-hmm. And we know that our community is often underpolled. And so, but what we're seeing and feeling undeniably is that there's an energy out there that we believe is going to show up in the final election numbers.
This is a special edition of the Daily Drum. Make it count. The power of your vote. Are you in? I want to briefly hear from each of you a little bit more about your organizations and what you're doing as it relates to this voting process. We talked a little bit about it before, but I want people to understand who we're talking to and what role you're playing. Christelle, talk to me about your role in the Student Bar Association at Howard University as it relates to this voting process coming up in 2022.
Yeah, so I'm the Social Action Committee co-chair, and one huge project that we've taken on this semester, or until elections, is to empower voters and to help them know how to protect their votes. So we've been doing this through reaching out to local organizations so far, we have North Carolina, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, to make sure that we're going to send students to these places so that they can go out and help empower voters. In North Carolina, it was a little different since we did do it in October. So that was more focused on the proactive getting out there, educating voters on what's changing in their jurisdictions, what they need to be aware of, and what they can do when they get to the polling locations, making the plans to vote early, making sure the registration is checked, all of that. But for Georgia and Pennsylvania, we're doing some more of what Stephanie was talking about being at the polling locations. We have people who are volunteering to be poll monitors, people working on the hotlines to make sure that any issues at the polling locations, anything that may come about, for example, if someone doesn't know that they can vote if they're in the line at the close of polling, and they may try to leave, knowing that that issue can be escalated up and then we can get them help for that type of issue. So that's what we'll be doing in November, right around election time. But just, I know for myself as a student going through K through 12 in this country, midterm elections were not very harped on. I know presidential elections got more focus, and I didn't truly understand the importance of midterm elections and just choosing the Congress and just choosing those local representatives who will be making those day-to-day momentous decisions for people in various jurisdictions. So that's kind of what we've been trying to do, and I think we've been doing a good job so far, and I'm kind of excited to see how this work will continue growing.
Yeah, I agree. It sounds to me like you're doing a fantastic job. Stephanie, talk to me about When We All Vote and the genesis of that organization.
Yeah, so When We All Vote, as you mentioned, is a nonpartisan initiative. We were launched by Mrs. Obama, Michelle Obama, in 2018, and our whole mission is to change the culture around voting and to increase participation in every election by helping to close the race and the age voting gap. So we focus a lot on communities of color. We focus a lot on young people. We partner with a lot of amazing organizations like Cliff and Black Voters Matter to do and support work that they do on the ground all over this country. You know, we also have our resources right now available for folks who are tuning in tonight, and we are 22 days away from the election. So we've said many times, you got to make your plan to vote, but we have a whole voter resources hub where you can check your status. You can find your polling place. If there is still time, you could potentially request your absentee ballot, but you can make your plan to vote early. You'll see us doing a really big early vote push starting today as we are preparing to host over 200 events around this country, early voting events, parties at the polls, as we like to call them. And we have a number of celebrity co-chairs who join Mrs. Obama in this work by lending their platform, not to try to convince people, but really just to reach people, folks who might not be thinking about voting, and it helps us to expand our reach to a lot of diverse communities. In addition to that, we have a program called My School Votes. You know, I know that we don't really have a lot of civics education in this country, so we're in high schools all around the country starting clubs and helping young people not just get registered, but understand how to advocate for the issues that they actually care about and really be involved in this democracy. We also have a lot of democracy work that we're doing which, you know, Cliff mentioned, democracy is on the ballot. Yeah. And for those of us who have the privilege to understand that and to know what that means, we have an added responsibility to ensure that as we go into the voting booth, that we're thinking about that, because there are people all around this country that could potentially be elected that don't believe in the legitimacy of the 2020 election. Also, they can set up some craziness in 2024. So we have a very big advocacy arm where we work to ensure that people are calling their senators to push for voting rights legislation so that we're able to protect voters, expand the right to vote, and we're able to really preserve our democracy and to make it better and to make it work for each and every one of us. So we have a lot of work we're doing. I already mentioned our HBCU campaign, but there's a lot of ways that people can get involved. You can become a voting squad captain. And one thing I'm going to tell everybody to do that's tuning in, make sure you take your photo when you go to the voting booth with your friends, not in the voting booth, but as you are standing
right, can't do that. Right.
Can't do that, but when you get your voting squad together, Mrs. Obama's getting her voting squad together right now, and use a hashtag voting squad and challenge people in your life to get their voting squad together, to make a plan to vote early, and to lift it up on social so that we're pushing and fueling the engine and the energy that we're already seeing on the ground, as Cliff mentioned, to get more people excited about making that plan to vote early.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for that. Cliff, we got about a minute or so. Talk to us about the Black Voters Matter Fund, for those who may not be familiar.
Yeah, well, first, I'm trying to get on that voter squad with Michelle Obama. How do I get on that squad? But yeah, the Black Voters Matter Fund is exactly that. You know, we believe that Black Voters Matter. We do partnerships and support work in 25 states across the country. And a big part of those partnerships is that we believe in order for Black voters to matter, that we've got to support the local organizations, the local infrastructure, the community-based groups that do this work 365 days out of the year. It's not just about coming out for 2 weeks or 2 months before Election Day. It's about doing the racial justice work all throughout the year. And so part of how we support that is over the past 4 or 5 years, we've given out over $26 million in funds directly to local groups, churches, NAACP chapters, neighborhood associations, right? This year alone, we're giving out over $8 million to such groups so that they can do the racial justice work and so that they can mobilize voters for this election cycle. But it's not just about giving out money. We're not a foundation. We always say that we're co-conspirators in our own liberation. And so part of the partnership means that we do things like helping to amplify the work that local partners do. We're sending text messages. We're sending over 20 million text messages just for this election cycle. We're doing radio ads. We're doing digital ads because we know, I think it was Stephanie that said that our young folks don't get a lot of news off of traditional sources.
Right,
and so
exactly.
We're putting it out through other mechanisms. Every type of voter outreach, knocking on doors, going to shopping centers and waving signs, doing our caravans all throughout communities, because the last thing I'll say is that part of how we show that support is that we travel all around the country in what we call the Blackest Bus in America. And right now, our national tour, which is called the We Won't Black Down Tour, is going to 12 states across the country, mainly battleground states, with one message: that in spite of everything that we're facing, in spite of COVID, in spite of white supremacy, in spite of voter suppression, in spite of all of this, we're not going to settle down. We're not going to quiet down. We're not going to lay down. We won't back down. That's the message that we're bringing all across the country on our bus tour.
Cliff, thank you so much for that. I only have a few seconds left, but before I take this break, Stephanie, could you share that phone number for me real quick? And also, Cliff, I need a website from you for voter information or resources.
Yeah, so that number is 1-866-OUR-VOTE, 1-866-OUR-VOTE, OUR. You can call that number literally anytime. They're up 7 days a week with lawyers ready to talk to you and support you. On our website, vote.org.
Thank you, Cliff. Website real quick if you can.
The quickest way to get the website, instead of me saying it because it's really long, is blackvotersmatterfund.org. But real quick, if you just look at that caption on the top of my screen, it says text We Matter to 25225. That's We Matter, one word, to 25225. That'll get you to the website and get you connected with us so you can get future information.
Thank you so much. We'll be back in just a few seconds. Now, before we go back to our guests tonight, we did reach out to both the Democratic National Committee as well as the Republican National Committee, and you're about to hear what their concerns are regarding election 2022. First, you're going to hear from committee chair from the DNC, Jamie Harrison, and then you're going to hear from Florida Congressman Byron Daniels representing the RNC.
The biggest concern is always making sure that people understand what is at stake in this election. Folks, understand this. For the first time in 50 years, instead of building on the rights that the American people have, we have retreated on those rights. And that is because Republicans have been, and a very right-wing court, have been focused on chipping away fundamental freedoms that we have in this country. The right of women to control their own bodies. And they've already indicated they're willing to go after marriage equality, contraceptions, and so many other things. It's about going forward, not going back. We're not going back. You know, too much blood, sweat, and tears has been spilled for us to retreat in terms of America. We have to go forward. And so my fear is that people don't take this thing serious enough. Folks, go to iwillvote.com. Make sure that first you're registered to vote. Secondly, that you have a plan to vote. And don't wait until the last minute. Go and vote now, because we never know what might come up. Have your voice be heard.
Well, my overall message is not so much for Republicans. It's for Americans. It's for the voting public. It doesn't really matter whether you're white, black, or Hispanic, whether you're rich or you're poor, or middle income, whether you're a Republican, an independent, a Democrat. I think the key issue is how are the issues that are being handled in Washington, D.C. affecting your life? Are open borders good for the American people? The answer is no. Is reckless spending in Washington, D.C. good for the American people? The answer is no. We see that in massive inflation. Is the Green New Deal better for the American people? The answer is no. We see that because the price of home heating oil is up, the electricity bills across the United States are up, food prices are up. All those are derivatives of energy production. And so I think if you take a step back and look at the issues that are affecting everybody's pocketbook, everybody's kitchen table, and you decide which party is better in terms of handling those issues on behalf of yourself and your family, I think people will choose the Republican on their ballot in their location across the United States.
Okay, again, that was RNC Congressman Byron Daniels, Congressman from Florida, representing the RNC, I should say. Also, before that, you heard from Jamie Harrison, who is the DNC committee chair. Let me go back to my guest, Stephanie Young, executive director of When We All Vote. Also, we have with us Christelle Chiwu. She's the Social Action Committee co-chair with the Howard University Student Bar Association. And of course, we have Cliff Albright, co-founder and executive director of the Black Voters Matter Fund. Stephanie, let me start with you. What did you hear from the DNC and RNC just now? Suffice it to say, a lot of politics there, no question about it.
I mean, I just heard someone talk about democracy and expanding and protecting the right to vote, which is the bedrock of our democracy. And then I also just heard some other stuff that wasn't, to me, very relevant in the moment that we're standing in. And I think that, you know, your listeners and viewers will have to make decisions on their own. We are a nonpartisan organization, but make no mistake about it, there is an attack on voters in this country, especially Black voters, young voters. And I think you could hear that very clearly. I think what's really incredibly important, and Cliff laid this out when he spoke earlier, is that, you know, we are in an unprecedented time when it comes to the health of our democracy. The number of people who are running for election in this country who do not believe in democracy is staggering. The fact that we are now, as the United States, a backsliding democracy because we're taking so many rights away from the American people, and our government since, you know, well before the insurrection, has probably been very unstable. So we've got a lot of work that we have to do to ensure that not only does this democracy work for us, but it works for generations to come. And we have to stay focused on that and not distracted by political fodder, but focused on the fact of the matter of where we are in this moment in this country.
What did you hear, Christelle?
Honestly, I did hear a lot of the things Stephanie was mentioning about. There was political jargon, and definitely there was speaking of a lot of things I can't necessarily say I can truly speak on. I do believe Stephanie and Cliff are much more equipped to speak on this matter.
Well, I appreciate your honesty in that regard, and so I will defer to Cliff regarding that. Cliff, what were you hearing from both the RNC and the DNC there?
Well, first, I think Christelle is probably far more capable of speaking about these issues than maybe even she thinks. And a lot of our young folks and students, that's what we believe, right? And so part of what we do is that we try to engage in these conversations. So if you ask me what I heard, and we are a nonpartisan organization as
Of
well, but as
course,
Black
yeah.
Voters Matter funds, because we are a C4, we can talk about issues and we can talk about advocacy, right? And so, without being partisan, I think just as a matter of objective fact, that if you're going to talk about inflation being a problem, then as a congressperson, it probably would make sense that you and your colleagues actually show up to vote on the bills that were specifically designed to reduce inflation. If you're going to complain that inflation is an issue, then as an elected official, it probably would be good to lower the cost of things like insulin that we know are causing, causing people to have to make choices between high rent and high medicine and other things. So if you're going to complain about that issue, then you might want to actually vote to do something about it. If you're going to say that infrastructure or the Green New Deal is a problem, then you have to come up with some answers. How do we deal with the dilapidated infrastructure in our communities? How do we deal with the dirty water in Jackson, Mississippi, and infrastructure problems there, or the fact that Flint still does not have clean water? So if you're going to say that that's an issue, then again, or if you're going to say that you don't want to spend money on that, then what you're basically saying is that you don't want to spend money on the issues that Black communities are telling us every day that they care about. And so, and I think that, part of our work when we talk to voters is, again, without necessarily being partisan and favoring one side or another, there are some objective facts that we can speak to. It's an objective fact that there are certain types of states under certain types of leadership that are leading the way and attacking our voting rights. That's just and that there's certain folks that will not vote for federal legislation to protect those voting rights. There are certain folks that will not vote for legislation like the George Floyd Policing Act. These are just objective facts, and we have the space to talk about our issues that our communities care about without necessarily taking a side. But we believe that, if we share information, if we generate enough discussions, and if we encourage folks to do their own research, you don't have to listen to me. You don't have to listen to Stephanie, right? We encourage folks to do their own research. And part of what we do is that we provide resources so that folks can find out who are the candidates and what are their records are. That's actually one of the biggest reasons why folks don't engage. It's not because they're apathetic or because they're lazy or they don't know that somebody marched to die. A lot of times it's simply that people don't feel like they can engage because they don't have the information. It's kind of like what Christelle said, right? Is people, when they feel like, I don't even know, what does the labor commissioner do? What does the Secretary of State do? And then who are these people that's running for it? I don't know who they are because nobody knocked on my door or gave me a phone call. When you don't feel empowered with information, then you don't engage. So part of what we do is to try to encourage folks to get that information. We try to provide the links and the resources so that they can do so, and then encourage those discussions that Stephanie was talking about, so that everybody can be involved in this as a collective, enjoyable process, one to be celebrated and not one to be feared.
Christelle, I have a series of important questions for you because you're kind of in a really unique position with this conversation. So you're from Northern Virginia, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, you're from Northern Virginia, but you live in Washington, D.C. While you're in law school. So where do you vote?
So I'm voting in Virginia just because I've always voted there, and I'm sure my registration, I checked my registration, it's good there, and that's what I'm used to, and my parents are there. But I know for me, it's a little bit different because I am close by, but other students are not close by. And then, as Cliff was mentioning, when you don't have those resources and you're not kind of reminded, students sometimes fall through the cracks because they live in other locations than where they've normally voted, and then they forget about deadlines. All of a sudden their registration's not good, or they forget to get absentee ballots. So I think that's also something that we've been talking about within the Social Action Committee as well, making sure that our students from other states know the procedures to make sure that they vote in their states, or if they're gonna register in DC to vote here, then that's what they're doing.
So how do you vote? Are you going to vote in person? Are you going to vote by mail? What's the process for you?
I'll be voting in person just because I am a first-generation lawyer, and my parents are immigrants, but they do vote as well. So just as I was speaking about before with making a plan and speaking to your family, getting those groups, I want to encourage my family also to vote. So I know that I'm making a plan with them to vote. So I'll be traveling down there to make sure that I'm rounding up the whole family and we're all going together.
Now, here's the big question for you. Why do you vote?
I vote because, as I had mentioned before, the theme of this past weekend was that if you're not at the table, you're most likely on the menu. And I think
that.
every single time I say it, it's so great. But I think it's important for a lot of young people to understand that in every single election, there's something huge on the ballot. There's something impactful on the ballot that can impact how we live our day-to-day lives, that will affect the legislation on a federal level and on a state level. And that's in every single election. So that's why I vote, so that I can be a part of that process and that I can have a seat at the table to make sure that I'm bringing my perspective to this process.
Stephanie, why do you vote?
Well, I view voting as my responsibility. I mean, I grew up understanding and seeing my parents not just vote, but my father was a bishop in the AME church. So he participated fully, from taking many souls to the polls all over this country, and including in the new democratic South Africa when he was serving there during the transition of apartheid to democracy, where I lived there as well. So I had the opportunity of seeing how powerful voting is, how there's many people all around this world who haven't maybe even had the opportunity or they're privileged because they don't live in a democracy. And I never grew up thinking that it didn't matter and my voice wasn't important. It was instilled in me. So therefore, it's my responsibility to take my gifts and my talents to help others see the light when it comes to not just voting, but participating holistically in the life of this country, politically, civically, and just being consistently engaged.
Cliff, why do you vote?
Well, I vote. Well, before I say why I vote, I think Stephanie and her dad would be interested to know that one of our national partnerships is actually with the AME Church, which has a unique history of all our faith-based institutions of really not being the oldest, but being founded on social justice activism. And so, but why I vote is, quite frankly, and my friend and sister and co-founder Latasha says this all the time, is somebody's making a decision that affects my life, then I want to be involved in that process, right? And so I vote because the people that are in these positions are controlling things and controlling resources that impact my life. Everything from the way that we enter this world, right, in terms of like the birth certificates that we received and the regulation of the hospitals, of where and when you can even be brought into this world, to the flip side of the spectrum, the way that we leave this world, right, in terms of our death certificates and regulations on funeral homes and everything in between, our housing, our education, our healthcare, our jobs. All of that is impacted by people who are in elected office, who have control, literally have control over our destinies, over our political destinies, right? And as we're seeing, literally control over our bodies. Yeah. And so I vote because I want to be a part of that process, and that I want to be a part of making this country be what it has always claimed to be, and the way that it always thought of itself to be. And as Langston Hughes said, America never was America. To me, it's not been, but it will. And we're going to do that by pushing it forward through our vote and through other forms of activism. But we need to be clear, it has always been the Black struggle which has moved this country closer to being the democracy that it was supposed to be, from the earliest days of the revolution and raising the contradictions of slavery all the way through our history of Jim Crow. And even today, we have always, with our voting rights battle today, we have always pushed this country towards being a more perfect democracy than what it's ever been. And so for all those reasons, that's why I vote. And for all those reasons, that's why we're sending the message this cycle that we collectively, we will not black down.
Yeah. Christelle, you are sitting on a great platform at Howard University and having the ability to to share in these resources, as you said, with the SBA, the Student Bar Association. But when you leave here with your law degree, how will you continue to connect with young people who do not connect with you through college? As you know, you're over 18, you have the right to vote, but not everyone, has the privilege, the blessing of connecting with, a big brain such as yourself, with a Howard University, tag to you. So what about the other young people? What do you believe is the best way to connect with them and encourage them to participate in the process?
Well, I think something major that goes beyond law school or just school in general is mentorship and reaching down to the next generations and paying it forward. I didn't know everything that I know today just off of my own strength. I had mentors before me who educated me and have invested in my learning and in my growth as a professional and personal development as well. So I think moving forward, that's something that I've always been big on, reaching back to the younger ones, mentoring other young Black women, other young men, hearing their voices. I always tell my male peers as well, Black men need a lot of mentorship. They need to know that they can speak out to reach out to someone who can help them guide their steps and become, successful in this changing environment in this world. So I think mentorship is a huge one, and making sure that we're connecting and that we're bringing these conversations up, especially as Black people, and reaching to other people of color. This is a huge topic that can't just be pushed under the rug or shamed. So I think, yeah.
Yeah, I well said. And as when I posed the question, as I said, you're in a great position, but again, not everyone has the opportunity to be exposed to a Christelle Chiwu from Howard University. Sometimes it's in your place of worship, or bumping into young people who are younger than you or around your same age, just on the street. And so I think that you need to, as you said, continue to carry that message forward. And I appreciate your answer. Stephanie, we only have a few minutes for you. I wanted you to just share some final thoughts with us before we have to let you go.
Yeah, if I could leave anything with the conversation, I do want people to leave feeling encouraged. That you have people like Cliff Albright that's fighting for our rights and ensuring that our communities all over this country are registered, that we have young people like Christelle who are standing up and playing her role and doing her part. And then you have organizations like ours that When We All Vote. If you ever want to get involved, we try to make the bar very low and easy, because we know that you're busy and you have a lot to do, but we want to make sure that everybody is playing their part, especially if you want to organize your community, if you want to, support young people like Christelle doing this work at other HBCUs around the country. There's room in this work for each and every one of us. And even though it is dark right now with all the things that we're facing, I heard a comedian say that, kids act real crazy when it's time to go to bed. They are bouncing off the walls. They have so much energy. They're having meltdowns. I mean, there's tantrums. There's a lot going on. That's because they know they're about to go to sleep. And so right now in this country, there are people who are losing it, okay? They are doing terrible things. They are being violent. They are being racist. They are doing all the things that they can because they know that they're about to go to sleep. So rest assured that it's time for us to make sure that we're prepared and ready to go, because people understand that we have, as African Americans, so much power. And when we all vote, we actually can change not just this country, but this world. So thank you so much for having me today. And I hope everybody stays encouraged.
Stephanie Young, Executive Director of When We All Vote, thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we will be in touch.
Thank you.
Okay, in these final moments or final minutes that I have, Cliff and Christelle, I want you to kind of share with us your biggest concerns about the upcoming election. The thing that really hits home for both of you. Cliff, I'll start with you. What is the biggest concern, dare I say, the thing that may very well keep you up at night?
Well, I think, we've been saying this now for the past 2 years. The thing that keeps us up at night isn't whether or not, we're going to be able to mobilize our communities. Like I said earlier, we're seeing a lot of energy and enthusiasm out there. We know that folks are going to come out to vote. We're confident in our ability to educate our communities, to raise awareness, to let them know the process and what their rights are. But I think the thing that keeps us up at night is whether or not these votes that are cast will actually be counted. One of the things that we've seen in the voter suppression laws that have swept the country over the past year and a half is that in state by state, you're seeing these mechanisms by which it makes it easier for people to overturn elections, right? In Georgia, basically they created a process where the partisan state legislature can take over local boards of elections at the county level. And they've actually already started that process of trying to overtake the Fulton County Board of Elections, and Fulton County being, the county that has the most Black voters in it. And so, if you take off just one county, not to mention 2, 3, 4, but even just one county in a state where there's a laser thin election, then you can change the outcome of these elections. And so we've seen that in several states where they're making it easier to not count votes, or they've made it easier for individuals to come after the fact and challenge individual voters, or not even just individual voters, to challenge a whole group of voters in like with these batch challenges where in one swipe they can say, oh, these 30,000 voters we think weren't really legitimate voters. And so some of these bills have made it easier to do that process. You've got people who are running right now for statewide offices, sometimes governors, sometimes secretary of state, who are running saying that not only would they not have certified the last election, but they won't certify this election or the 2024 election. They are running on insurrection. And so the thing that worries us the most is not whether or not we can mobilize our communities, but whether or not our community's voice will actually and accurately be counted. That's what keeps us up at night. And that's why we made the case for the past 2 years that we need federal voting rights legislation, both strengthening the 1965 Voting Rights Act, but also having some new provisions to deal with what we call election subversion that we're seeing all across the country. And the last thing I'll say on this point is that if we're going to talk about voter suppression, we've got to talk about, I'd be remiss if on WHUR, I didn't mention that one of the oldest forms of voter suppression is the denial of the full vote to residents of the District of Columbia. We've got to deal with voting rights in the district. We've got to deal with DC statehood. That's a voting rights and voter suppression issue. And again, that's what we're most concerned about this election cycle.
Christelle, what is your biggest concern as we move closer to Election Day, this election season? What's the thing that keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I think Cliff took a lot of my answer. I was going to say that, like you mentioned, just making sure that people's votes are actually cast and actually, being accounted for, because so many regulations and ordinances are changing and people are not aware. I think that's why the work that we're doing now in these earlier days is so important, because if people don't know how to have confidence in casting their ballot, then there could be issues. And we want to make sure that we're preventing that.
One of the things you did mention, Cliff, you were talking about, voting rights in DC. Do you believe that there are any other kinds of issues that could motivate people to come to the polls? I mean, all politics are local, as we know. Is it the Roe v. Wade issue? Is it inflation? Real quick, you've got about a minute. I'll let you share your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think there's several of these issues. I think definitely Roe v. Wade and abortion rights is an issue that Black voters are concerned about, because what we know is that for us, it's not just a matter of women's choice. Like, that's important in and of itself, but it's also for us, it's a healthcare issue, because Black families, Black maternal mortality is 3, 4, 5 times higher than white maternal mortality. So for us, it's literally a matter of life or death. It's also a criminal justice issue, because we know that if people are criminalizing abortion, if they're going to be criminalizing and profiling women traveling interstate from state to state in search of reproductive services, who do you think is going to be overly policed? Who do you think is going to be the ones pulled over the most on these highways when we already deal with driving while Black? And so it's a criminal justice issue. It's an economic issue. And so this is an issue that I think is going to really drive turnout, and it ought to drive turnout, not just for Black women, but for Black men as well, because it doesn't just impact the women in our community. It affects our entire family, our entire community. So that's an issue. Obviously, police violence is an ongoing issue, and that's also a local issue as well as a federal issue, right? People are fighting over police accountability at the local level. People are fighting about infrastructure at the local level. Again, clean water or roads, or in Black rural communities, broadband access. That's a local issue. So all these issues have a local dimension, but they're also reflected in terms of federal policy.
Well, I want to thank both of you for helping me continue this conversation. Chriselle Chwu with the Social Action Committee at the Howard University Student Bar Association with Howard University School of Law. I really appreciate your input in all of this. Also, Cliff Albright, co-founder and executive director of the Black Voters Matter Fund. Thank you so very, very much. And finally tonight, Election 2022 is the most important election of our lifetime. This election really counts, and so does your vote. Yes, it's just one vote, but it is your vote. It is a precious right. If it weren't, candidates for office would not try to convince you to cast it in their favor. So this is your chance to make your voice heard. The power is in your hands. Take the time to vote this election cycle and the next. And the next. I'm Harold Fisher. Thank you for watching and listening. Good night.
This program was produced by WHUT and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. For more information on this program or any other program, please visit our website at WHUT.org. Thank you.